Hey there! So let's say that you finished implementing your Databricks code. You stored it in a GitHub repository, and now you would like to deploy it to Databricks workspace in a secure way without using your personal account or using some secrets or passwords. And in this episode, I will show you how to do this securely using a service principal and federated credentials defined in Microsoft Entra. So let's get started. Alright, so the setup is as follows. We have our GitHub repository with our source code that we would like to deploy to Databricks workspace that lives in our subscription. And we also have some Microsoft Entra ID tenant defined. And our goal here is to basically deploy stuff from GitHub to Databricks without any passwords. And why without any passwords? Well, first of all, passwords might leak, right? They are just texts. And someone might use them in a malicious way to mess around with your Databricks workspace, with your target environment. Secondly, those passwords, those secrets, they have some expiration periods and they have to be rotated periodically. And very often people forget to do so, which results in your deployment pipeline to stop working. And when using federated credentials, we will avoid those issues and still it will be secure. So what I will do in this episode would be as follows. So I will create a service principal in Microsoft Entra, and please note that it differs from a different scenario where I created the service principal inside Azure Databricks. In this scenario, when we do this in Entra, we'll be able to use this service principal to deploy stuff not only to Databricks workspace, but also to other services inside Azure, like Data Factory, Logic apps, Functions apps, and so on, right? So it gives you more enterprise solution. So I will create the service principal for dev environment, right? I will grant it reader permission on my subscription so it can log in. And finally, I will allow GitHub repository to use the service principal. And I will do this by creating this federation credential. It's not a policy, it's a credential. Policy was in Databricks, but this time it is different. So we'll create those federated credentials that will allow GitHub to use it. But inside those credentials, we'll define that only this particular repository will be able to use it, and only when deploying to dev environment, nothing more. So it's tightly secured. So let's do this. Let me jump to my target environment. So I have this federated identity Entra Git repository created that for now contains only some Databricks stuff, a very basic one. And what I did was to clone this repository to my local environment. And as you can see, I have a very simple Databricks job defined, hello world, that contains a single task that runs this hello Python script that in turn prints hello world statement. I also have a very basic Databricks asset bundle definition that deploys this stuff to a target environment, nothing more. So to make it work, we have to create this GitHub action, this workflow that will allow us to deploy stuff. At this moment, there is nothing created in my repository, and to avoid creating everything from scratch, I will just use this simple workflow template. That's one that will adjust in a second. Let's give it a name and let's verify what it does. So it triggers on push to main, on pull request to main, and it can be done automatically it can be done on demand. That's fine. It runs on some Linux machine, it gets the repository, and then it prints some statements that we don't need actually in this case, so let me remove them. And let's commit those changes. And please note that in this example, I'm doing everything directly on the main branch, which is a bad practice, but for the simplicity, this is fine. Now, this action, me checking in stuff to the repo, it already triggered my workflow. So we can see that basically the triggering works. It didn't do anything yet with my Databricks code, but at least we can see that it is working. Now, we know that to deploy Databricks asset bundles, we have to have this Databricks CLI installed, and then you got to use Databricks bundle deploy command. So let me add this to my workflow. But first, let's pull those changes. So I have the workflow definition available. And let's add those steps that deploy bundle. So basically, I'm installing Databricks CLI, I'm checking who is logged into Databricks, and I'm trying to validate and then deploy the bundle. All right, let me push this to the repo, added Databricks stuff. But of course, it would be better to do this in a proper window. Added Databricks stuff, and let me push this. That should trigger my deployment action. That should fail because we didn't specify any authentication yet. And it would be very bad if anyone could just connect to my Databricks workspace, right? So it will fail. Yeah, it fails because default authentication, default credentials are not specified, and that's fine. So what I will do now will be to create this service principal in Entra, in Microsoft Entra, and we'll use this service principal for deployment purposes. So this is my Microsoft Entra. Let me go to app registrations and let me create a new one. And let me call it GitHub Dev. And let's register this. Cool. So we have a service principal created. Then for authentication purposes, let's go to certificates and secrets. And what many people did in the past was to just create a client secret, a password that will be later used in GitHub. But that's not what we want to do today. Instead, we'll use federated credentials. But before we start creating them, let's define those environments in GitHub that will allow us to narrow down the usage of this particular service principal. So let me go back to my repository, to settings, and let's create a new environment like dev. And maybe prod as well. Prod. I'm not configuring them yet. I just want them to exist. Alright, so let's get back to our service principal and let's create this federated credential for it. And first of all, we've got to indicate, alright, in which scenarios we want this service principal to be used. And we want to use GitHub Actions because that's what our scenario is, right? Then we've got to indicate, alright, which organization and repository are we dealing with. Basically, it means from which repo this service principal will be able to be used, will be allowed to be used. And for organization, we know that's table on Azure. In my case, we can get this from repository URL. The same for repository name. It's federated identity Entra. So let me paste this. Then for entity type, we can narrow down the usage of this service principal. And in my case, I want to do this based on environments. Like I want to be able to use this particular service principal only when GitHub deploys to dev environment. And let's give it a name, like GitHub dev, without space, obviously, like so. And let's add it. And that's it. We created this federated credential. No passwords is stored, right? So now, how to use this stuff? So first of all, let's grant this service principal some permissions in my Azure environment. And basically, I will give it reader permission on my resource group that contains my Databricks workspace. This is fine. So let me add new role assignment. I basically need some assignments so it can log in. Reader. And I want to use service principal. It was called GitHub, or how did we call it? GitHub dev. GitHub dev, this one. Yes, please. Let's grant it reader role. All right. Then we've got to create this service principal in my Databricks workspace so it can log in there. And by the way, in my Databricks workspace, there is no this hello world job available yet, right? Because we didn't run it. So to create this service principal, let me go to settings, identity and access, and service principals. And let's add new service principal, and it was called GitHub dev. And take a note that Databricks knows this principal exists in Microsoft Entra. It is not managed by Databricks. No, it is external one. So one more time, GitHub dev. And yes, please, let's add it. And that's my service principal that is external. It is managed by Entra, not by Databricks, like we had in this case. All right. So we have this service principal created. Now, the next step is to make use of this service principal. So let's go back to our workflow and let's make some changes so it could be used. So first of all, we've got to grant some permissions to the workflow itself. This one is very important, so those OpenID Connect tokens can be fetched and they are used under the hood to make the connectivity work. Then let me define the environment to which we want to deploy this environment set to dev, because that's what we used in our federated credential. And then let me define some variables that will be used to authenticate to Databricks workspace. So that's the address of my Databricks host, the dev one. And I'm indicating that, hey, please use Azure CLI for authenticating purposes, right? And this will be very important in a second, because what I have to do is to add yet another step to log in to Azure Databricks using CLI before I start doing anything with Databricks. So that's the step. So I'm logging into Azure using Azure CLI, and the same identity will be later used to log in to Databricks. And just to make it a little bit secure or reusable, what I did was to define those three variables that I will define in my GitHub environment. So actually, let's add them. Azure Client ID, that's the first one, on my dev environment. So let's add this as a variable. And this Azure Client ID, basically that's the client ID of the service principal that we want to use for deployment purposes. And we can get this from Entra. So that's our service principal, and that's the client ID we get to use. So let me copy this. And let's paste it here. So that's the first variable. The second one is Azure Tenant ID, inside which this service principal is created. So again, let's add new variable called Azure Tenant ID, and we can get this again from Entra. That's the one, directory or tenant ID. Let me copy this, and let's paste it to GitHub variable. And the last one is Azure Subscription ID, and we can get this as a name. And for example, we can get this, that's the subscription to which I want to deploy my stuff. That's the subscription inside which my Databricks workspace lives. And that's the subscription ID. And that's it, right? So what we did was to modify our workflow to log in to Databricks using Azure CLI authentication. And we authenticate to Azure by using this client ID taken from variables. And it should work. Added Azure stuff. Let me pull this. And hopefully there are no errors. And in this setup, the action went fine. Let's see how it works. So basically, what happens under the hood? So our workflow executed from GitHub is trying to log in to Azure using the credentials that we specified. Basically, it uses the service principal, right? Then it installed Databricks CLI. We can check who is logged into Databricks and take a note that it displays this GitHub dev name. That's the name of our service principal, right? So it looks fine. It was able to validate the bundle, validation okay, and it was able to deploy it, deployment complete. And if we go to jobs and pipelines, we can see that yes, this Hello World job has been deployed. So let me run this. And by the way, take a look that the creator and run as identity is set to our service principal that is defined and managed in Microsoft Entra, right? So everything looks fine. And the job was executed and it printed Hello World statement, right? All right, so to summarize, by using this federated credential defined in Microsoft Entra, we were able to securely deploy our stuff from GitHub repository using GitHub Actions to Azure Databricks without providing any passwords and secrets, without worrying about expiration of those secrets. And it simply works. Secondly, usage of this credential is limited only to my GitHub repository and only when deploying to this specific dev GitHub environment, because that's what we defined in federated credential. If we tried to copy this code and use it from a different repository, it will fail. And finally, because we used a service principal that is managed and available outside of Databricks, we can use it, the same service principal, to deploy other stuff as well, like data factory stuff, logic apps, function apps, whatever, right? So that's a very enterprise-ready pattern. And that's it for today. Thanks for watching and see you next time. Take care.